Well, good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Subcommittee on Capital Outlay and Transportation. This morning we've got a couple presentations and items to review. And first up, we have the update on Capital Square projects and capital priorities with Secretary of Administration, Lynn McDermott. Good morning.
Committee members. As you'll recall, Senator Locke, Joe D'Amico and I presented to you last year around this time the projects and the initiative that we had underway on space planning. So this is an update of that presentation that was presented last year. So if we can turn to the, thank you, Tyler. We're going to go through the Monroe building, which, as you know, has been scheduled for demolition, or at least getting people out of that building for a while. And then all of the projects that we have mostly completed. So it's a day of celebration for a lot of the Capitol Square projects that are now completed. So the current state of Monroe is, as you can read this, we have a significant amount of deferred maintenance to do in that building. It's a building that our employees really want to get out of. It's not functional. It is safe. We do all of the proper safety updates that need to be made. However, it's very dysfunctional. Things like ADA accessibility in the restrooms, and the elevators are not reliable. So those are the kind of things, and there's a long list of them, that are really the impetus for us to get people out of that building. So coincident with that, as you know from last year, we brought in JLL, a consultant, to look at our space standards and to look at where do we put those people that are now in the Monroe building. And they basically came up with options, as you can see in this slide. One of them was we could renovate Monroe. We could get it up to standard. It would take quite a while and cost over $900 million to get it to a place that it needed to get to. The other, and this is in the budget, I think, at least the planning, for a building at 7th and Main. And we're currently demolishing the old VEC building at 7th and Main. And there's also language, I think, in the budget to stabilize that property and green it until a decision is made on what to do with it. We had an option to move Monroe tenants to 100% lease space. As you well know, the lease market and the office space market is fairly depressed, and we did a cost study that it could be cost beneficial to lease. Around that time, we got instructions from the General Assembly to not allow for anything more than a 3-year lease, which escalated the cost of the lease versus existing space analysis. So we moved to a hybrid model where we could put as many people from Monroe into owned state buildings as possible, which of course would be very cost beneficial, and then lease space for those non-executive branch agencies. So what the next slide shows you what we've come up with as our plan, and I know this is little and a lot of detail, but it does give you the from to, that we plan to move the people from Monroe primarily into Main Street Center, which of course is the lottery building, the building with the big lottery sign on it. That if we consolidate space in that building, we can in fact fit many of the agencies that are in Monroe into Main Street Center. As we began this process, we went and spoke with every agency in Monroe as well as every agency in Main Street Center. The DGS folks did their normal kind of analysis of space and determined with lottery that they would like to move outside of the city for a large number of reasons. Their director has put together a list of both business reasons as well as cost reasons. It's cost neutral. Things like parking for the people that come to collect their, I don't know what you call it when you win the lottery, but their prize. Parking for other stakeholders that come in, And space, they need reduced space. They have quite a bit of space in the lottery. So this slide will show you that lottery would like to move to a building out off Staples Mill Road, which is where our workforce development new agency is moving as well. So that's part of our proposal, and you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is what comes up with, on the next slide, Tyler, please, our request for $20 million to actually modernize Main Street Center. What we want to do is avoid Main Street Center becoming another Monroe. So we would like to upgrade that building, reduce the space standards within that building, put in new collaborative space where people can work together, and make that building more of a contemporary office space. And our estimate for that is $20 million. The other item in the budget is to demolish Monroe. That's the median cost. We got two estimates. One is $60 million, the other is $19 million. It depends a lot on what approach is taken to the demolition, but that's our current estimate on what it would take to do that. We plan to have everyone out of Monroe by July 1, 2025, if this budget is approved. And at that point, I think probably next fall we'll know more about what the demolition cost would actually take. I think it's obvious that we don't want to leave the building standing empty. So either we demolish it or perhaps even go to market to see if there's any other use for that building. Any questions on the Monroe move before we get into the other projects?
Any questions from the committee?
Okay, thank you.
Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to see the space standard the JLL
Sure.
provided for you.
Okay, absolutely.
I appreciate that.
We have a complete report from them. We'll get that to you this afternoon. If there are no questions on that, as I said, this is, I think, a real tribute to DGS and the work that they have done over the last 4 or 5 years. And that's all the completed project, one of which we're in today. And the only 2 projects left in Capitol Square, Reed's Row, which will be completed next month. It's really ready. It's just tweaking Reed's Row. And then the 7th and Main demolition, which will also be done in February. That's spaced down at 7th and Main. The other project that's still on the books is the courts building, which will go where Pocahontas was. We're reevaluating that project, have met with the Chief Justice and his staff, and they need more people. Apparently, they've had more justices approved or staff, so they need a little bit more space. They would like to look at the workflow, and at that point, we're reevaluating the design, and we'll develop a cost and schedule estimate for that new program. A lot's changed since that building was originally designed a couple of years ago. So that's my update. I'm happy to answer any questions. I also would like to introduce Acting Director Bezonia, who is here to probably answer questions better than I could. Mike is here in case you have questions.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Deeds.
and I apologize for my voice, but isn't there language in the budget that calls for planning for the building of a new state office building where the old one was at the corner of 7th and Main?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what's going on with that planning?
I think we have to adjust it. I don't know, we talked to Director Keyes about that when we met with her a couple of weeks ago. I apologize for not understanding the process for doing that, but I think we've got to adjust that language. Am I right,
So
Director?
what does that mean exactly?
I don't know.
Senator McPike, Senator Deeds, what I think we talked about with staff when the secretary was here, if they wanted to no longer do that planning, they needed to have somebody put in a budget amendment to eliminate that, since it is required currently under law.
So I will talk to Secretary Cummings and Michael Mall about how we accomplish that and see what what needs to be done.
Okay.
That was an oversight, I think, on my part.
Any other questions? One follow-up to
Sure.
the proposed, I guess, swing space and shift. Well, I guess it's not swing space. You're proposing multi-agency permanent move to the current lottery building. And
Exactly.
then current uses and program there to be relocated.
Right.
In your cost projection, you indicated, what was the annual lease cost to the lottery? You said it's net.
It's 1.7 million, and it's 1.7 million in the new building.
Okay, in terms of ongoing annual lease cost?
Yes, sir. And that includes the fit-out, the T&I and FF&E is rolled into the lease. And there's even a remote chance that we can reduce it because of charging those employees parking would offset lease costs, so that's still being discussed.
Thank you. And those come out of lottery proceeds?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Therefore, education funding, right?
Correct.
Thank you. Senator Locke.
Education is currently in Monroe.
Yes.
As those plans unfold for the Monroe building, where will the Department of Education be?
We're thinking about right now, and I'm talking to Superintendent Coons about this, is some of them in the old City Hall building and others in Main Street Center. Some of the more back office staff functions could go into Main Street Center. And she would like to be in Old City Hall close to Patrick Henry. It has a great place for her board to meet. One of her concerns is her board meeting, which meets frequently. So we're thinking of that, as well as DHRM in Old City Hall, which was the original plan. Thank you, Senator.
Next up, we have a review of transportation funding. Laura Farmer, Chief Financial Officer. Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, Senator McPike, and the rest of the committee. This morning, I'm going to give you a view of the preliminary 6-year financial plan and how the Commonwealth Transportation Fund forecast for state revenues impacts the previous assumptions. So transportation relies on the state revenue forecast from the Department of Taxation. They provide revenue estimates for the entirety of the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, all of its major sources, and also the dedicated sources that go to the regional authorities in Virginia that have been established over the last 10 to 12 years. The December revenue forecast that we were provided impacts revenues through 2030. So due to the assumed economic outlook and the changes that we saw, the transportation revenues over the period through 2029 reduced by $405.5 million, or 1.3% of the funding available. The forecast included an update to the estimated revenues. They included the governor's 2024 tax policy proposal in those assumptions. And so per that proposal, the amounts that are attributable to the additional sales and use tax revenue generated by the taxable services and digital personal property that are distributed to the CTF would be directed by an off-the-top distribution according to the proposal. So 1/2 of those revenues would be deposited into the Transportation Trust Fund, the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund, and 1/2 would go to the I-81 Improvement Fund until the end of fiscal year 2031, or such time as the total that has been provided is $400 million. And so the table at the bottom of the slide just highlights the estimates that were provided by the Department of Taxation of the governor's tax policy changes, and then what that assumed distribution would be. And so to get to $400 million for I-81, it falls just beyond the 6-year planning horizon. We would go out to 2032 based on the assumptions. We did a modest 2% growth beyond 2030, and the assumption is after you get to 400 million, that half a share dedicated to I-81 would then become available for CTF normal formula distributions that go to all the modes of transportation. This slide just provides a view of the CTF revenue estimate and highlights the impact of the governor's tax policy proposal separate from the regular retail sales and use tax performance that's anticipated. For a total of $4.8 billion in the current year, growing to almost 5.6 by 2030. This slide highlights just the changes from the previous estimates. So we used taxes forecast from December 22 to adopt our 6-year planning documents in June 23. And so this slide just provides the highlighted differences between each revenue source over the previous assumptions through 2029. So when you include the governor's tax policy proposal, the total net change is positive 108 million. When it's removed, there's a reduction over this planning period of just over 405 million. So we use the estimates from the state revenue forecast as well as our estimates related to federal revenues that will be available to Virginia and other components of financing available to transportation to derive the 6-year financial plan. So it identifies all the funding available for all the modes across the Secretariat that have funding available through these state revenue streams. Our preliminary estimate is almost $55 billion over the 6-year period. It includes financing for Route 58 and I-81 debt that's been previously authorized to deliver projects. It also includes just over $6 billion of planned transfers to the 3 regional authorities, Central Virginia, Hampton Roads, and Northern Virginia. And then it also includes the dedicated fuel tax revenues for I-81 of $577 million over the period. In terms of allocations, we anticipate allocating $16 billion for maintenance and operations. That includes both VDOT maintenance as well as our financial assistance to localities or city street payments. We also are expecting $17.8 billion for construction over the period. It's important to point out that approximately $3 billion of that is funding from others, mainly the regional authorities who are providing funding for delivery of projects that VDOT is administering. A big share of that is the latter half of the tunnel in Hampton Roads is a big component of the early years of this activity. This slide just provides a view of the revenues available in major categories, the top section being those state transportation revenues and the funding that we believe will be provided by others, as well as other trust fund revenue, things like toll revenue and other major categories that are not included in the state transportation forecast. We also estimate federal revenue that will be available for Virginia under the auspices of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act from a few years ago and its ongoing assumptions. The middle section of the slide highlights the debt financing for I-81 as well as Route 58 that are planned and correspond to project delivery. And then the bottom of the slide highlights those regional transfer payments. So the funding that's provided to the regions flows through VDOT as well as DRPT for WMATA capital dedicated funding. This slide just provides the preliminary snapshot of allocations ranked by the order in which we prioritize that. We have debt service of the debt of the Commonwealth Transportation Board across many programs, and then other state agencies and transfers, which most are enumerated in the Appropriation Act. Maintenance and operations includes both VDOT and locality payments, and the remainder of the programs are highlighted there on the left-hand column. And these are the assumed allocations for each one of those program areas and the changes year over year. These are preliminary numbers. I would highlight that our Metropolitan Planning Organizations program, CMAC and RSTP, those are two very special federal categories of funding. So though you see a reduction in public transportation, that's just a reference to how we program funding. We pull it all back to construction and allow the MPOs to confirm those allocations annually. And then when we adopt the 6-year program in June, you'll see that those will change again. But last year, almost $160 million of CMAQ funding was provided to mass transit, and so it will repopulate in the progress that we make over the spring. Otherwise, major differences are progress related to construction of various projects and also the impact of the state revenue forecast. That concludes the slides I've prepared, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the committee? Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tyler, other items for the committee? Looking forward till next week.
Senator McPike, next week, Kendra and I will go in a little more detail on the capital outlay projects and transportation changes in the introduced budgets, and then we may present member budget amendments that have been submitted for those areas as well.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Deeds.
Tyler, could you clarify for me the question I asked earlier about planning? Well, there is language in the budget that calls for planning of a new office building at the corner of 7th and Main, and the administration has no authority to unilaterally cancel that planning. Is that correct?
Senator McPike, Senator Deeds, you'll remember in the September budget that you passed, you reaffirmed that the executive branch should plan for a new office building at 7th and Main Street, as well as the demolition of the VEC building on that site. And there is no rescinding of that planning in the introduced budgets as introduced by the governor.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Deeds.
has there been any budget amendment introduced that would call for the rescinding of that authority, that planning authority?
Senator McPike, Senator Deeds, there's not.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, Senator Shane and I were presenting a bill downstairs, and so I left them to it and ran up. If I remember, maybe this is not specifically on this, but there was also some capital expenditure for DMV. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, Senator McPike, Senator McDougall, there is a non-general fund appropriation in the introduced budgets for DMV to do some improvements to their headquarters that is on Broad Street in downtown Richmond, and we will cover that in more detail next week on the amounts that are authorized.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. April, team. We will continue the discussion as we move forward. The committee will rise.